In 1986, Andres Martinez lost control of his tanker truck and crashed into a mountain pass in Spain. He and his wife died on impact, but their 10-year-old son Juan Pedro was nowhere to be seen. No sign or remains of him have ever been found to this day, as Interpol has called it the strangest missing person case in Europe. The founder of North Face, Douglas Tompkins, died from hypothermia after a kayaking accident in 2015. He'd been traveling with longtime friend and Patagonia founder Yvon Chouinard in the mountains of Patagonia. In 1964, actor Peter Sellers inhaled some poppers before getting in bed with his wife. He was apparently trying to achieve the ultimate gasm, but instead suffered 8 heart attacks over a 3-hour span. In 1999, tobacco manufacturer Philip Morris tried convincing the government of the Czech Republic that smoking was highly beneficial to the country. They argued that more people would die earlier as a result of smoking, thus helping the government save millions on pensions, hospitals, and housing for the elderly. Ariana Grande reportedly has a longtime stalker named Paige Neiman who tries to impersonate the famous singer. She's been obsessed with Grande since she was 12 years old and has allegedly undergone several plastic surgeries to look like her despite being only 20 years old. When the Titanic sank, the richest passenger on board was business mogul John Jacob Astor IV, who had enough money in his bank account to build 30 Titanics. He ended up giving up his spot in the final lifeboat to instead save the lives of a random woman and her daughter. These were the last photos of Garrett Miller, taken just minutes before a soccer goalpost tipped over and struck him in the head, killing him instantly. In 2013, a family dog named Killian was protecting a baby boy from an abusive babysitter by standing between them and growling at her. This made the boy's parents suspicious of the babysitter, so they hid a recording device under the couch and heard her swearing at the baby while possibly shaking and slapping him. The sitter eventually pleaded guilty to assault and battery of a child and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. John Cena holds the all-time record for the most Make-A-Wish visits by far, personally granting over 650 wishes for children with life-threatening illnesses. Many of these visits have taken place in intensive care units or hospice settings, oftentimes with children who would pass away weeks or even days later. Hospital staff have said Cena routinely stays far longer than scheduled, sitting with families after cameras are gone, letting kids talk about fear, death, or unfinished dreams while he stayed fully in character as their hero. He's never publicized these encounters himself and refuses to use them for branding, saying he sees them as his life's purpose rather than for charity. Cena has also privately supported veterans suffering from severe PTSD and traumatic brain injuries, including meeting wounded soldiers who believed their lives were over due to permanent disabilities. Several veterans later said those conversations with the wrestling legend single-handedly saved their life. Cena has consistently avoided receiving any public credit for these interactions. In 1998, Lenny Dieriksen was eating breakfast with his 19-year-old son when a stranger suddenly showed up at their Oklahoma farm. Lenny went out and spoke with the man for several minutes, before coming back inside and telling his son that the man wanted to look at one of his stud horses. But after leaving his home in the man's truck, Lenny never returned. He was apparently seen having lunch with the stranger at a local coffee shop a few hours later, but the trail went cold as the stud horse that Lenny mentioned was never visited that day. 6 months later, someone called 911 claiming he saw Lenny at a local bar, but he was gone before police could get there. The case remains unsolved to this day. In New Brunswick, Canada in 2013, 2 little boys were strangled to death by a 100-pound python while at a sleepover at their friend's house. The snake apparently snuck into the apartment through a vent connected to a pet shop below the boys' room. Experts claimed it's highly unlikely for a python to just go on a human killing spree, but the boys had gone to a petting zoo earlier in the day, so they may have smelled like food to the snake. The snake was euthanized, and the snake's owner was eventually found not guilty of negligent homicide. In 2013, well-respected meteorologist Tim Samaras became the first storm chaser killed by a tornado along with his son Paul and friend Carl. The Oklahoma tornado expanded from 1 mile to 2.6 miles in about 30 seconds and was the largest ever recorded. It suddenly took a sharp turn towards the group, leaving them screaming their last words over the radio, "We're gonna die." These were the final photos of extreme cave diver Dave Shaw just moments before his final dive into South Africa's Bushman's Hole. He blacked out at 872 feet while retrieving a fellow diver's body, and his helmet cam recorded his demise. Osama bin Laden's son Omar was severely beaten by his father for smiling too widely when he was a young boy. He trained in Al-Qaeda camps starting at 14 years old, but left the terrorist organization in 2000 since he didn't support the idea of killing innocent civilians. In 2006, Gail Laverne Grimes died in the hospital after surgeons spent 6 exhausting hours trying to separate her skin from a couch. The 500-pound woman had been sitting on her living room sofa for 6 years to the point where her skin had completely fused to the fabric. Rescue workers had to transport Gail in her couch using a trailer, and she ended up dying while still attached to it. According to his memoir, when Vice President J.D. Vance was 12 years old, his drug-addicted mother was once driving erratically and threatened to crash her car to kill them both. J.D. had no choice but to jump out of the speeding vehicle and run to a nearby house for help. He now refers to this event as a turning point in his life, since it prompted him to move in with his non-abusive grandmother and work towards a more stable life. In the year 2000, Mexican woman Ines Ramirez performed an hour-long C-section on herself after suffering 12 hours of constant pain. Using a large kitchen knife, she made a 7-inch vertical incision and pulled the baby boy out of her own uterus. Despite no prior medical training, both Ramirez and her baby miraculously survived. In 1996, 16-year-old Travis Lewis pleaded guilty to the murder of Sally McKay. While seeking closure, Sally's daughter Martha visited Travis several times in prison and eventually forgave him for killing her mother. When he was released on parole 23 years later, Martha allowed Travis to move in with her and gave him a job as groundskeeper of her estate. But when she realized the man was frequently stealing from her, Martha fired Travis and kicked him out. Soon afterwards, Travis broke into Martha's home and stabbed her to death before drowning in a nearby lake while running from police. This man died after making the dumbest mistake of his life while camping out in Alaska. In 1981, American wildlife photographer Carl McCunn hired a bush pilot to drop him off in the Alaskan wilderness. He planned on camping by himself for 5 months to take photographs of wildlife, but would soon realize he'd forgotten to arrange for a return flight. As the weather grew colder and his supplies began to dwindle, Carl soon realized that he may never return home. At one point after he lost all hope, Carl was seen by an Alaskan state trooper plane but was ignored because he raised his fist in celebration, and a raised fist is known to be a signal that everything's okay. Referring to this incident, Carl wrote in his journal, "It's certainly my fault I'm here now. Man, I can't believe it. I really feel like a klutz. Now I know why nobody's shown up since." Sometime afterward, Carl ended up taking his own life by shotgun. Carl's campsite and corpse were found a few weeks later, along with his journal which detailed his harrowing final months. Martha Stewart once dated Anthony Hopkins but broke it off with him after watching The Silence of the Lambs. She says she couldn't separate Hopkins from his cannibalistic character Hannibal Lecter. RFK's assassin Sirhan Sirhan is still alive today and has been denied parole 17 times. According to historians, we would have a lot more Egyptian mummies intact today if so many of them weren't eaten during the Victorian era. People used to believe that the ground-up corpses of ancient Egyptians could cure different ailments. Harvey Weinstein reportedly had gangrene around his private area, giving his shaft a Frankenstein look that appeared as if it was chopped off and sewn back on. His ghoulies were also removed during treatment of his gangrene, leading to several of his victims suspecting that he was intersex. When Roman Emperor Commodus was in power, he had his men gather all the dwarves and disabled people they could find around the city. They were brought to the Colosseum where each of them was given a meat cleaver and forced to fight to the death. Right after purchasing some hot coffee from McDonald's in 2004, 79-year-old Stella Liebeck accidentally spilled it into her lap, causing horrific third-degree burns. The woman quickly went into shock and was hospitalized for 8 days while undergoing skin grafts. Since the burns were so bad, her lady parts had melted and fused to her legs. Stella suffered permanent disfigurement after the incident and was partially disabled for 2 years. She then sued McDonald's for making the coffee way too hot and was only seeking $20,000 to cover her medical bills. But McDonald's refused to settle with Stella as the media completely demonized her, calling her the poster child of frivolous lawsuits. However, people quickly changed their tune when photos of the horrific burns finally released. With one of the jurors being so traumatized, he forced his wife to quit drinking hot coffee. Stella ended up winning $2.9 million in damages from the lawsuit, but her life was never the same again. In 2016, Texas father Daniel Shaver was held up by police after he was seen pointing a pellet gun out of his hotel window. Several officers had rifles pointed at Schaefer in the hallway as he attempted to comply with them, but their commands were confusing and contradictory, especially since Schaefer was drunk. For example, they told Schaefer not to put his hands down for any reason before telling him to start crawling towards them. As Schaefer was crawling and begging for his life, he reached back to pull his pants up and was killed instantly by Officer Philip Brailsford, who later claimed he thought Schaefer was reaching for a weapon. Brailsford was charged with second-degree murder and found not guilty, since the full unedited footage wasn't released until hours after his acquittal. Brailsford was rehired by the department and reimbursed for all the medical expenses he paid, while seeking treatment for the PTSD he claimed he acquired from the shooting. Because of this, Brailsford was medically retired and now collects a $2,500 pension every month. RFK Jr.'s gravelly speaking voice is caused by a rare neurological condition he developed in his early 40s called spasmodic dysphonia, which causes the muscles that open and close the vocal cords to spasm involuntarily. Here's what he used to sound like before this condition versus after.
And if somebody dumps something into the river that's poison, and it goes into a drinking water intake, and children drink that drinking water, that is child abuse. I think those vaccines we need to have, again, true double-blind placebo-controlled trials on that. There's 25% of Americans.
While the true cause is unknown, people who do a lot of public speaking are far more likely to develop this condition. RFK required a titanium bridge in his vocal folds to be able to speak at all, and receives Botox shots in his vocal cords every 4 months. He says it's painful to hear himself speak and feels sorry for those who have to listen to him. 12. This 15th century Italian painting is the earliest known depiction of the guinea worm, an awful parasite that has haunted humans for thousands of years. It enters the system through dirty water containing its larva, and grows into a 3-foot-long worm that eventually erupts from the skin, causing an incredibly painful burning sensation. To relieve this, people often splash water onto the affected area, prompting the worm to discharge more larvae into the person's body and start the horrible cycle all over again. There were more than 3.5 million guinea worm cases in 1986, but that number has been significantly reduced in recent years. Armed only with a knife, Master Sergeant Roy Benavides went to assist a 12-man Special Forces team who were surrounded by 1,000 Vietnamese soldiers during the Vietnam War. Following the grueling 6-hour battle, Benavides had 37 puncture wounds, exposed intestines, and a broken jaw. He was pronounced dead until he managed to spit blood in the face of the man who was zipping up his body bag. Benavides eventually made a full recovery and was awarded the Medal of Honor for his heroic actions. 13. In 2016, fitness instructor Missy Beavers was beaten to death while setting up for a class inside a Texas church. The case gained national attention after security footage showed a person wearing police tactical gear walking through the church and opening various doors. Police are certain this was Missy's killer, but he or she was never identified. Here are some lovely photos of Colombian drug lord Griselda Blanco with her son Michael. Blanco ordered a hit on her third husband Dario, who was killed by a gunman inside his car while Michael was sitting next to him. It's estimated that Griselda was responsible for at least 200 murders while transporting cocaine to the U.S. In 1986, California cop Craig Payer pulled over college student Kara Knott before beating her with his flashlight and strangling her. The officer was interviewed by the news during coverage of the murder investigation, and scratches that were inflicted by Knott could be seen on his face. Payer was soon found guilty of her murder. In 1968, 22-year-old Kenneth McDuff was sentenced to death for raping and murdering 3 young teens. He was later resentenced to life in prison and got off on parole in 1989. Within just 3 days of his release, McDuff started killing again and proceeded to rape and murder at least 6 more people before he was finally executed in 1998. 17. Talented artist Norman Lee worked for Marvel Comics for nearly 20 years until he suddenly disappeared in 2015. He was snorkeling in the Cayman Islands with his wife but never returned ashore, and his body was never found. In 1996, 16-year-old Jonathan Capewell died as a result of his obsession to smell good. The teenager covered his entire body in cologne at least twice per day until he eventually died from a heart attack. At the time of his death, Capewell had 10 times the lethal dosage of butane in his blood after the gas built up in his body for several months. In 1974, a group of 6 men entered the Hi-Fi audio store in Utah and held everyone inside hostage. The hostages were then subjected to brutal torture, including being forced to drink drain cleaner, which left them with horrible burns in their throats and mouths. One of the victims had a ballpoint pen inserted into his ear that was stomped on until it punctured his eardrum and came out his throat. All 5 hostages were later shot in the head, 3 of whom died. 2 of the perpetrators were sentenced to death, while the 3 other men involved were never caught. In the year 2000, 11-year-old Candace Newmaker died during an extreme therapy session in Colorado. The adopted girl was undergoing attachment therapy when 4 unlicensed therapists decided to perform the controversial treatment known as rebirthing. She was wrapped in a flannel sheet and covered with pillows to represent a womb and was told to fight her way out of it, with the apparent expectation that this would help her attach to her adoptive mother. All 4 therapists used their body weight to push down on Candace and resist her attempts to free herself. Candace screamed several times that she couldn't breathe and was gonna die, and even started to vomit, but was simply called a quitter by one of the therapists. 40 minutes into the session, Candace was asked if she was ready to be reborn, to which she faintly responded no, which would be her last word before she died of asphyxiation. All 4 fake therapists were prosecuted, 2 of whom were sentenced to 16 years in prison after the disturbing footage was shown in court. The Babushka Lady was the name given to an unidentified person who was present at JFK's assassination in 1963. He or she was seen filming before and after the president was shot in the head, but later disappeared into the crowd. That recording may have been crucial in revealing the truth about JFK's killing, but the person has never come forward with the footage. Austrian Mayor Hans Steininger died in 1567 after breaking his neck by tripping on his own ridiculously long beard while running from a house fire. In 2010, a Russian man died after being voluntarily buried alive by his friends. He was simply trying to overcome his irrational fear of dying when the ground suddenly caved in and crushed him. In 2008, a British woman died in one of the most embarrassing ways possible. Her husband admitted he would hook homemade clamps to the woman's nipples and administer electric shocks to turn her on. Apparently, it went a little too far this one time, and the woman was electrocuted to death. The husband was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to at least 20 years in prison. When Jimi Hendrix was 16, his mother died from a ruptured spleen at the young age of 33. But Jimi's father didn't allow him or his brother to attend the funeral. Instead, he gave them shots of whiskey and told them that this was how men should deal with a loss. After several hours of drinking on board a ferry, Englishwoman Emma Blackwell fell to her death. She'd apparently been imitating Kate Winslet's pose from the Titanic movie and lost her footing before plummeting from the ship. Smile mask syndrome is a psychological condition characterized by prolonged unnatural smiling. It can lead to painful strain of the facial muscles and result in an inability to stop smiling even when agitated or upset. In 1993, Missouri man James Scott damaged a levee on the Mississippi River simply to delay his wife from coming home so that he could party. Instead, the river ended up flooding over 14,000 acres, and the 23-year-old man was sentenced to life in prison for intentionally causing a catastrophe. In 1995, 13-year-old Thad Phillips was kidnapped while he was asleep in his Wisconsin bedroom. He'd been abducted by 17-year-old Joseph Clark, a local boy who was obsessed with the sound of bones breaking. Over 48 grueling hours, Clark broke both of the boy's hips, legs, shins, and ankles with his bare hands. Phillips eventually managed to escape from the nightmare and reported Clark to police. Sometime later, Phillips was sitting at home awaiting the trial when one of Clark's friends rang the doorbell and shot Phillips twice in the back, apparently to prevent him from testifying. Clark was sentenced to life in prison, and Phillips was eventually able to walk again. In 2008, Indigenous Canadian man Brian Sinclair went to the hospital because of a blocked catheter. After many hours passed in the waiting area, other patients began to urge medical staff to attend to Sinclair, who was clearly in pain, but they responded that they were helping other patients and would eventually get to him. After 34 hours had passed, Sinclair ended up dying in the waiting room and had already developed rigor mortis by the time medical staff attended to him. Turns out he had a very treatable bladder infection and could have easily been saved. This 1968 photo shows South Vietnamese women and children just moments before they were killed in the My Lai massacre. Witnesses later stated that American troops tried tearing the blouse off the woman in back as her mother attempted to protect her. In 1899, brothers George and Willie Muse were kidnapped from their farm in Virginia by a freak hunter when they were just little boys. Born with albinism, they were forced to perform in circuses for the next 25 years under the names The Sheep-Headed Cannibals and Ambassadors from Mars. They were often ordered to partake in disturbing acts such as biting the heads off of snakes or consuming raw meat in front of crowds. The brothers essentially worked as modern-day slaves until their mother found them working for the Ringling Brothers and successfully sued for their release. In 2002, German actor Gunther Kaufmann confessed to falling on his accountant during a fight and accidentally suffocating the man to death with his 260-pound body. The actor was subsequently sentenced to 15 years in prison as a result of the incident. But 3 years later, it was revealed that Kaufman was innocent and had only confessed to protect his dying wife, who had actually murdered the accountant. After a night of drinking in 2010, Michigan man Jeffrey Duthette was sleeping in his bed when his dog Kiko suddenly bit off his toe. When he went to the hospital, it turned out the toe had a bad infection that likely would have spread and killed Jerry if left untreated. Thus, the dog had saved his owner's life. 2. In 1997, the Cat in the Hat Thanksgiving Day Parade float careened out of control due to high winds, knocking a lamppost into the head of Kathleen Carana, putting her in a month-long coma. She sued Macy's and the city for $395 million and ended up settling for an undisclosed amount in 2001. Kathleen eventually purchased a nice New York City apartment with the settlement money, but just 5 years later, Yankees pitcher Corey Lidle crashed his plane into her building and the engine ended up in her bedroom. Luckily, the crash happened just minutes before Kathleen was due to arrive home, but Lidle and his flight instructor were both killed while 21 others in the building were injured. Adding to the weirdness of this story, the flight instructor's friend was also supposed to be on this flight but got stuck in traffic and told them to leave without him. So he managed to escape death until just 1 month later when he was killed in a separate plane crash. 18-year-old student John Savage was spared during the Columbine massacre in 1999. He was hiding underneath a table in the library as Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were going around shooting random students. At one point, Harris aimed his gun at Savage and told him to identify himself. A friend of Klebold's, John, showed his face and asked Klebold what he was doing. The shooter responded, "Oh, just killing people." Savage then asked if they were gonna kill him, to which Klebold responded no and told John to run out of the building, which he did. Cello player Mike Edwards was an original founding member of the band Electric Light Orchestra. Tragically, he died in 2010 when a massive hay bale rolled down a hillside and collided with his van. In 2008, a man from California injected cocaine into his arm and apparently thought he accidentally injected some air into his vein. So he quickly ran into a Denny's restaurant and attempted to amputate his own arm using a butter knife. Police eventually subdued the man with a taser and rushed him to the hospital as Denny's closed for the night. In 2010, Dr. Jacqueline Koterick tried breaking into her ex-boyfriend's home by climbing down his chimney. 3 days later, a house sitter discovered her decomposing body inside after she apparently died from mechanical asphyxia. In 2008, a woman from China cut off her husband's beaver cleaver with scissors while he was sleeping, after he reportedly brought another woman home and requested a threesome. While the man was recovering from the surgery that reattached it, his wife cut it off again and threw it out the window. In 1989, Montana woman Patricia Meehan was driving on the wrong side of the highway and eventually crashed into another car. She emerged from her vehicle with a confused look on her face before climbing over a fence and staring back at the wreckage. Patricia stood there for a few moments before wandering into the open field behind her and disappearing into the night. Despite hundreds of reported sightings of her in the months that followed, she hasn't been located to this day. Some investigators suspect Patricia suffered from amnesia as a result of head trauma, but the case remains unsolved. In October of 2011, famed narrator David Attenborough found a skull in the garden of his London property. He immediately informed police, who later determined the skull belonged to the victim of a gruesome murder during the Victorian era. Julia Martha Thomas was killed by her housemaid in 1879 before being chopped up, boiled, and fed to local children. There's a room in the basement of Oregon State Hospital known today as the Room of Forgotten Souls. In 2004, hundreds of copper cans were discovered holding the remains of 3,600 mental patients who were cremated on site starting in 1917. Built in 1628, the Swedish warship Vasa was hailed as the greatest warship ever built, but infamously sank just 20 minutes into its maiden voyage, resulting in the deaths of at least 30 people. After it was salvaged in 1961, archaeologists found that the ship was horribly asymmetrical. Apparently, some of the builders had measured in Swedish feet, which was 12 inches, while others had measured in Amsterdam feet, which was 11 inches. The ship was knocked over by a mild gust of wind less than a mile into its voyage.